Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today it is the 28th of December, and today's video is very important as we're beginning with Velyka Novosilka. We'll work our way to the northeast by focusing on Pokrovsk, Andriivka, and finishing off with Kursk. Along the way, we'll also discuss various updates when it comes to troop rotations, this time with an added focus on Russian groupings in the Kursk region. So we're going to just go through all of those videos and territorial changes as we move forward. And once again, sorry for the inconsistent upload schedule. I actually had some really nasty, egregious Wi-Fi issues over recent days and just scheduling issues. But, going into the new year, I'm going to do my best to improve the frequency of uploads. And once I sort of flatten out and am able to catch up with all the updates, the quality will then improve drastically, I believe. Looking first at the region west of the Mokriali River, you can see here in the yellow shaded colors the recent Russian advances from the past week. So you can see between Rivnopil and Novodarivka, the Russian forces consolidating control over 3 square kilometers of territory. The most interesting update from this region comes from this spearhead that is formed. It amounts in total to a Russian breakout of 2.5 kilometers northwards. In what you can see is the final road that connects Velyka Novosilka and Vermivka, for that matter, to the rest of the Ukrainian defensive nodes in this region. So there were originally 7 roads that connected to Velyka Novosilka. You could see them on the map as we zoom in. I'm going to hover with my mouse over here over all of them. And now either they are under just Russian complete control because the Russians cut them off, or the Russians are utilizing them directly to advance into the center of Velyka Novosilka. And so this was the final one, the final road that the Ukrainians had access to physically, of course, from Russian artillery and drone crews. They were not able to escape, but based on this geolocation from December 26th, there was an indication that the Russians were able to actually cut off the road that connected it to Huliapoli, which is one of the most important Ukrainian cities in this region. It is further to the west in Zaporozhye, but it is very important. A lot of Ukraine's fortifications are built around here. And I'd actually say that there was a larger emphasis on building defenses around Huliapoli than there was on Velyka Novosilka. But now that road has been cut off, and it just speaks to the dire matter that the Ukrainian troops are in here, even though the Ukrainian forces at the entrance to the city have been able to stave off attacks. And when we're looking at that, I'm referring to attacks that the Russians really started about a month and a half ago, utilizing this highway over here to push towards the eastern entrance. And you could see how the line is stabilized, but around the flanks, especially around the western flank, there has just been a depletion when it comes to the necessary amount of manpower to hold on to certain pieces of territory. And that really manifested with the villages along the Mokriali River Valley, beginning with areas like Makariivka, which were cut off. And I can't believe I never even talked about it, but now you could see the Russian forces took over 10 square kilometers of territory along this river valley region, and it expanded. You had Blaudatnia taken over in its entirety, then Storozhove. You could see the videos here. There was a bunch of them. This is for the 48th Assault Battalion, which is part of the Ukrainian 123rd TDF Brigade. They're one of the key units operating around here. They actually have the manpower on the ground, not just drone crews, but actual troops that are fighting in these pockets, in these tree lines. So they're doing a lot of that dirty work. And it acts as a vanguard, essentially, because it buys time for the Ukrainians that are a bit further northwards in the city itself. Also in Storozhove, you have the deployment of the 110th Mechanized Brigade. You can recall that they have been a massive factor throughout the battles in southern Donetsk, whether it be in the Andriivka region or then near the Volkhov River Valley. And since then, it has had, you could say, maybe 2 months of less action on the front line because, the 59th Brigade then sort of placed it for a while in the areas where it was deployed, and we just didn't see that much of a public footprint from them. But now they're being redeployed to this very critical area, and it is absolutely necessary because I was really sounding the alarms for a couple of months now that the Ukrainian garrison in Velyka Novosilka would be totally inept if the Russians decided to increase their operations. And we could see that manifest. And the best proof is that the Ukrainians had to move in additional resources, which is enough to hold off, these sort of attacks coming directly from the east, and also to a certain extent drag out the fighting in Novi Komar. That is absolutely true. but it can't account for everything. And that's why we're seeing the Russians breaking out now to the west in areas that are just not that fortified, in areas that are completely open, where the Russians now have a lot of experience hopping from village to village and from field to field, utilizing, in a lot of cases, actually just private vehicles or motorcycles or desert crosses. And you don't see as many large mechanized assaults over here. Because that's not the nature of the Russian advances in these areas. But looking at some of the other Ukrainian forces in this garrison, 32nd Mechanized Brigade, I haven't heard much from them recently, but they are recorded to be around here. They may just have a presence slightly to the west of Velyka Novosilka, but there are a few other high-profile units with, their mark based on publicly available info. And you can see some of them over here. It's still not enough to hold on to Velyka Novosilka. Really, nothing would be enough at this point, because even the localized counterattacks around Novi Kumar were successful for about a week before the Russians were able to, make their presence known again, as was shown here in December 15th. And so the supply lines are just not suitable now that the final road has been cut off to the external Ukrainian positions on the rear. So you have right now this lid that amounts to like 7.5 kilometers, and that's the lifeline for the Ukrainian forces, hundreds of them, several battalions worth of men that are directly in this very small piece of territory, this very small salient, and that's their lifeline. But of course, they're going to continue resisting in this area, because the loss of Velyka Novosilka would then give the Russians unfettered access to all those 7 roads that branch out of it, and would give the Russians opportunity to then move forward along the Mokryali River if they so chose. But of course, there are other opportunities when it comes to flanking the really, really well-defined trenches built across the line of contact, about 10 kilometers behind the line of contact in Zaporozhye. That's something that I've been looking at long-term, and I'm going to continue warning about that, because those could be a part of Russia's broader plans for this region, and it all begins with Velyka Novosilka. So just keep an eye out for that. But first, let's look at the area south of Andriivka. Over here, you can see continued Russian advances. Russians did use Rozdolnya for an extended period of time as a forward operating base for attacks towards the Mokryali River and Novi Komar. And so in a similar fashion, the Russians are utilizing Yaza Polyana and Maximivka, because really you have this large gap in between the next settlement and where the Russians are coming out from. It's like a 8 to 10 kilometer distance. It's a very, very long track to do out in the open against Ukrainian drone crews primarily. And so that's why the Russians had to build up the infrastructure in these 2 villages in order to turn them into areas to house infantry before attacks. You can see that south of Andriivka's suburbs, you have Russian advances amounting to 8.16 square kilometers. Here's the proof of this. You have from December 26th, Ukrainian grenade drops onto Russian troops and tree lines southeast of Rozliv. And here you have the 23rd Brigade. 23rd Brigade mechanized units is very, very critical in terms of defensive actions in this region. You could see them. They are not only involved south of Andriivka necessarily, but are also trying to put a lid on any expansion the Russians may be thinking of north of Rozdolnya. So they are a very critical component of the Ukrainian defense over here. So they just conducted FPV strikes onto advancing Russian infantry in these fields. And that's most of what we're seeing from the Ukrainians here, drone crews. There was a period in time where they tried to send in armored vehicles, some of them from the marine elements as well, to conduct localized counterattacks to fire towards advancing Russian forces. But now they've sort of just reverted to FPV crews doing most of the work from, I'd assume, somewhere in the basements of Andriivka. We're not really seeing any ground confrontations because the Ukrainians don't have that many well-built positions here. They don't have many trenches or dugouts. It's more so just the settlements themselves. So they're located in those regions like Rozliv, Konstantinopil, Ulakli. Those regions are, of course, under the Russian purview right now. When it comes to Zelenivka, the Russians have taken full control over that village, along with Sukhyali and most of the southern river bank of the Sukhyali River. So this amounts to 5.5 square kilometers. It also includes the hamlet of Hihant. You can see that over here, in addition to areas near Konstantinopolsk. So what this means is that the Russians have really done most of the work when it comes to clearing out these areas, so they can focus on the northern bank, which includes areas like Yantarnya. That's an important area because it just serves as a sort of Ukrainian stick out. It just sticks out from the rest of the Ukrainian positions in this region that are more uniform to the north. It is you could refer to it as a vanguard for the Ukrainian forces, whatever remaining companies of defenders are operating around here. They are really doing the work of creating a buffer or an extended buffer between the line of contact and the various roads and open fields that reach all the way up to an area like Dakhne or then all the way to Shevchenko. So the Russian forces in this region that were really involved with the operation to cleanse Uspenivka for a couple of days now. They've been involved in this operational pause, which is completely understandable because they engaged in very high level fighting, intense, fierce fighting, clearing out numerous villages and really dug in Ukrainian defenders. And you're looking at very notable Ukrainian or Russian units, I should say, that were involved in these operations that we have not heard from that much ever since. So just imagine once they're done with either a rotation or just several weeks of recuperation, how much of an effect they will have on the battlefield in this region north of the Sukhi Ali River, because there really is a formidable grouping of forces that was involved with clearing out this Ukrainian pocket, and they could emulate that sort of activity with this new pocket that is being formed. You can see it already on the map. You could see that the Ukrainians have this semicircle shape that they're trying to hold on to, and it includes using the Sukhi Ali River as a barrier. Then you have the front line, which the Russians are currently advancing through. They're advancing westwards. And then you have to the north the thermal power plants, which is a massive hub for Ukrainian defense. So to zoom in, you can see that the Russian forces have taken over at least 3.62 square kilometers west of Dalnya. Dalnya is now an important outpost for the Russian infantry because, look, east of Dalnya, you really don't have any other possessions. So for any sort of, say, hiding in basements or organization overnight, it has to be in this specific location. There aren't any other options. And so the Russian troops attack from here. They expand westwards into open fields and tree lines, and also into the 2015 trenches that were built as a perimeter around Kurakhove, which now have really not had their use utilized, and they've not been utilized by the Ukrainians much because the Russians were able to take over the majority of the city through direct action, either from the east or slightly from the south. And so all of this massive perimeter, which was really well built, it ended up being sort of superfluous. And now the Russians are actually using it as a vehicle through which to advance, because, you know, you get into a certain anti-tank ditch or into a long extended trench, and then you could use that as an avenue through which to just advance very deep horizontally towards the Ukrainian rear. Okay, so here you have from December 24th, FPV strikes onto Russian soldiers in these said trenches. And you can see how it's already giving the sort of southern punch, because most of the fighting is occurring within the urban cluster or directly west of it. So now the Ukrainian defenders also have to deal with the Russians putting pressure from the south. So again, another pocket forming, this one even smaller in size, that has a potential to overextend the Ukrainian forces. Ukrainian forces are still holding out in this sort of outstretched area because they have, troops, very small amount, but they're still resisting in the Pivdenia district of Kurakhove. So let's zoom in on that for a second. You can see over here that Pivdenia, I have not marked it as under Russian control. According to Deep State, there are still Ukrainians resisting over here, and I have not seen enough geolocations to back up a full Russian capture. Russian sources have published footage of their capture of certain key locations in the city, which would include the city hospital, much of this high-rise area. There's really a lot of facilities over here that the flags have been raised over. Not this, but over here. You have the 5th, 110th, and 114th Brigades. They were the main, grouping, hodgepodge of units involved in the capture of Kurakhove, especially in recent weeks, clearing out this western section, which has a really, really well-built citadel. But for the most part, it has not been completely decimated because the Russians, they were able to take advantage of their momentum and create a flanking maneuver. So, for instance, you had the 5th Upload Brigade advance along this Zaporsky Road, as it's referred to, and that was their vector of attack. Whereas the 110th, I believe, they pushed directly from the east and were involved in clearing out the private residential areas before, putting frontal pressure onto the Ukrainian defenders, largely from the 46th Air Assault Brigade. Then the 110th or 114th, I don't remember. Let's click on their icon. You could see that they were involved with this sort of rear maneuver where they were able to take advantage of previously captured territories in the southern portion of the citadel, including the local school, and moved from the south to the north from this western direction took over the city hospital and some of the garden regions. And as a result, we're able to create this very, very tight pockets wherein Ukrainian troops in their groupings and platoons were almost surrounded. They weren't completely surrounded because the Ukrainians regularly sent in tanks and armored vehicles to relieve them and target the Russian forces on either side of the flanking maneuver. But it was just simply not enough to resist for any extended period of time. And by now, we could see that the entirety of these apartment complexes have been taken over by the Russians. And that's why the Ukrainians held on. They wanted to, of course, utilize the really good concrete slabs, the protection that it offers, the basements for an extended period of time to drag out fighting, but it simply was not feasible due to the Russian maneuvers that caught them so early on. And as a result, really meant that casualties weren't that high for the Russian side in this area. Now, the Russians have not stopped. They are continuing with their pressing in this region because they don't want to create a scenario where the Ukrainians are situated in a massive stronghold like the thermal power plant and then use that very concentrated corridor fighting in order to trick the Russians and just buy time while the Ukrainians on the rear in Andriivka build up defenses. So the Russians are just continuing the momentum, not giving the Ukrainians any sort of breathing space. And so here you can see December 28th, the 46th Brigade, their drones targeted numerous Russian infantry, and you could see direct hits. And those are Russian soldiers that are walking through this rail line region, or I don't know if that's a rail line, but they're walking through this area with a lot of shrubbery and these just paths leading directly into the thermal power plants. And then here you could see a geolocation within the administrative building of the facility because there were two Russian soldiers dragging a wounded comrade through and into the building. And that's the indication that the Russians have already been able to make it into this location. So it's in advance of around 2 kilometers. And when we're speaking about a dense area, an urban cluster that's been fought over heavily, 2 kilometers is, of course, pretty significant. And it means that the Ukrainians are going to have to immediately prepare for defense within the complex itself. So you have also the substation around here. It's not just a thermal power plant, but also this mechanical plant and another one located over here. So there are several facilities that the Ukrainians are going to utilize. And I don't know what's going on underground to the extent to which there is a sophisticated tunnel system, whether all the facilities, all three of them are connected together, that I don't know. But definitely the Ukrainians are going to try to use that to their advantage. At the same time, you have to keep an eye out for what's going on to the south because there is a potential for the Ukrainians to just completely lose any connection in Pivdenia, and then they'll be completely overstretched and have to abandon these massive arrays of fields, tree lines, and dugouts. And then that will give the Russians free reign to attack from the south as well, which will further complicate the defense of the thermal power plants. Well, just remember, after the thermal power plant, you have this open road past the Dakhnia all the way to the suburbs in Andriivka and Ulakli. So that's what the Ukrainians have at stake. And that's what this pocket over here is really meant to do, to buy time for the Andriivka garrison. You could see that the same thing was emulated when it comes to the region between Sontsivka and Stary Terny. For a very long time, a very small amount of Ukrainian forces resisted in this region, either east or west of the rail line. And Russian forces did not make this area a priority for a while. And so the Ukrainians did find it possible to hold out in small groups. There wasn't much of an impetus for the Russians to expel them. Of course, they were subjected to daily shelling, but there wasn't like a ground maneuver to push them out. But with the full capture of both of these villages, it just became untenable for the Ukrainians to hold on to territory that is really not well built for defensive, protracted defensive operations. And so now you have the Russians in control of another 12 square kilometers. And here's a geolocation from December 24th of the 46th Air Assault Brigade conducting FPV strikes onto Russian soldiers, including some on motorcycles that were advancing from positions in Stary Terny and trying to make their initial forays into Shevchenko. And again, doing it at this point is not going to be successful on the first try because Shevchenko is critical. It's the final settlement before reaching Andriivka, and it's very close to many other well-built fortresses. And so the Ukrainians have fallen back and consolidated over here to a certain degree from territorial defense elements from the 59th Brigade, maybe they're operating a bit to the north, but definitely from the 35th Marine Brigade. And so now the Russians are eyeing this possibility of getting a foothold in Shevchenko. So I have to see about that. But to the north of Sontsivka, you have a minor advance. just taking over additional plantations and fields with the objective of eventually reaching Stovyanka and Petropavlivka, and then circling westwards and reaching the northern flank of Andriivka. But for now, it's not the highest priority for the Russian side. Where we're seeing a lot of movement, really just insane amount, is in this higher elevated ridge, which is now completely under Russian control. I'm going to circle it for you guys. Just this massive region under, it's very high in elevation. You can look at the elevation map and see it's in between these two large depressions. One of them is a river valley, the Solana River. You can see the Solana River and the way that it connects to all these various local villages over here, and then all the way to the east crosses into Selidove. And then you have this not necessarily river stream, because I don't see any bodies of water, but it is just this lower valley that a lot of villages are located in and sort of coalesces around Ukrainka. So the area in between is located on higher elevation and overlooks the surrounding regions. The Russians in recent weeks have been able to take it over in its entirety, and it gives them a lot of local advantages when it comes to then assaulting the remaining villages in Donetsk Oblast before reaching the border with Dnipro, because this is now a really big possibility for the Russian side. They're only about 7 kilometers away from the border between Donetsk and the Dnipro, and there's a lot of reasons why they would want to do it, not just for battlefield regions, but also, of course, for the PR reason of reaching another oblast, negotiating chip, whatever it may be. But reaching that area would really be significant on the battlefield as well, because capturing the entirety of areas like Uspanivka, Novoserhivka, and then when you look southwards at this chain of villages, Nadivka would open up a massive opening. There would be a massive gaping hole in the Ukrainian line in this region I'm circling over here. You just have this extreme lack of trenches, settlements, any sort of Ukrainian presence, any presence of the armed forces of Ukraine. And it's an area that could be very easily exploited and taken over by the Russians in a rapid period of time if the northern flank is taken over in its entirety. So that's something to look out for. And that would have massive implications for the Vavta River Valley that Andriivka crosses through, but not just for Andriivka, but for any other settlements located to the west of it. So that's even looking past Andriivka, a massive concern for the Ukrainian forces in this region that have not seen addressed or mentioned really by anyone. So just keep that in mind as we move forward. But when we look at the advances, Russian troops here have been able to advance west of Zoria. Somali battalion is operating here, so DPR units, they're now deployed to this region. Ukrainka was taken over in its entirety by the Russian side. In addition to Novoelenivka, the Russians have made the first entrance into Novoelizavetivka on December 27th, where there were met by grenade drops onto their armored vehicles. So for now, the Ukrainians here have been able to keep the Russians at bay, but the Russians are now preparing to storm the settlements, and then that will give them that open road to Nadivka and eventually to the Solana River. So that's just something very important to look at over here on the border between Donetsk and Dnipro. When it comes to Novovasilivka, again, this is an area where there is a larger concentration of Ukrainian reinforcements, and it's a fallback line, so it's understandable that the Russians have been unable to advance in that location. But in all the fields to the south of it, there have been notable Russian advances. These are areas that the Ukrainians simply cannot hold on to. They're trying to focus on areas that they could maintain control over, like settlements. And then whenever they see Russians advancing through the vast wads of open fields, that's where the drone crews come in, especially Birds of Magyar. They're playing a big role in the defensive activities over here. Looking a bit to the north, just would be just south of Vovkove, Russian forces have taken over a massive chunk of open fields, forest plantations in this region around the pond, which puts them in a prime position to reach the Ukrainian high ground. The Ukrainians actually do have high ground in this region. It is based around the T0406 highway and the railroad leading into Pokrovsk itself. So you have these two really important supply lines, and then you have the regions surrounding it that are located on a sort of mound that overlooks surrounding regions, including the current battlefield in many cases, especially around the Solana River Valley. And so the Ukrainians do have a bit of an elevation advantage in this location. Russian forces, despite that fact, have been able to cross over the Solana River, fight tooth and nail for Pischane, Shevchenko, etc. And now they're on the outskirts of Solone and Vovkove. Really, the significance would be that if they capture these villages, they can then advance northwards and cut off certain supply lines to Pokrovsk and also take over those hills which overlook and dominate the surrounding regions, which would finally give the Russians an important topographic advantage, because in this specific region they don't have that to a certain degree. Pokrovsk and nearby suburbs are on generally higher elevation than the avenues through which the Russians are advancing. Looking a bit to the south, the Russians are engaged in heavy clashes in Pischana. Here you can see December 20th, Skala Battalion, they pushed the Russians out of the southern parts of the village. But since then, the Russians have been able to take over most of the residential areas and have now entered into the industrial zone. Here you can see the Skala Battalion with their FPVs striking Russian soldiers that were attacking the industrial zone. And so you could just get an indication that those troops have been able to cross over through either the residential area or through these fields that start south in Shevchenko, and have actually made it into some of the facilities. Again, a big issue is that the fall of Peshana will then immediately follow and give the Russians a route into Zvirove and Leontovichi, and then you already reach Pokrovsk itself from an area that was completely not anticipating this. They were not anticipating an attack to come from the southwestern flank. There was a lot of preparations done for the area to the east, and to a certain degree also for choke points along the E50 highway and the rail line. But then an attack coming in from the southwest, that really was unheard of, because the front line was so different. You didn't have this massive sort of Russian blossoming. That's what I would refer to it. I wouldn't really call it a salient. I'd call it a blossoming, starting with Selidove, because you could see how the front line really did not appear to be built or shaped in a way that would provide the Russians with an avenue to attack from south. But now they have that, and it's a lot due to the attacks that have come past Selidove. And so now there is an imminent threat to the Ukrainian garrison in Pokrovsk, and every day it becomes larger and larger, not just when it comes to territory, because territory, we see the Russian advances, we're marking it. We could see that here it's 4.3 square kilometers, here it's 50 hectares. Here, south of Zelenet, they took over 5.5 square kilometers of fields. That's all, of course, known, but there's also the fact that the Russian forces in territory that has already been taken, they're continuing to consolidate control over there and move more troops, move their command posts, move their artillery systems and mortars and drone crews closer. And so then that will present a threat over time, a cascading threat for the Ukrainian forces located in Pokrovsk, especially if the Russians are able to gain control over local heights to sort of have some sort of parity with the Ukrainian forces that are located on those ridges running through the city itself. When it comes to the Chenske, you can see the Russians took most of it over. Here you have December 25th, the video from the Dovbush unit in the 68th Jaeger Brigade conducting FPV strikes onto Russian soldiers wandering through the village. There's heavy clashes going on in Lysivka. My mapping of it has not really changed, because I had the Russian soldiers in areas that are currently being marked as newly captured by the Ukrainian side. So either I was wrong or they were wrong. I don't know. I don't know what's sure. What I know for sure, I should say, is that this is the current breakdown of the front line. I just don't know if the Russians recently were able to gain over there. And now we can move on to the battlefield in Toretsk, where we do have continued Russian advances. There has been sort of stabilization, not entirely, because there are pieces of evidence indicating the Russian infantry have continued to push deeper and deeper into the city, which really is incredible, because you're looking at an area that is just perfect for Ukrainian defensive holdouts. You're looking at just massive landfills, mines, industrial warehouses, facilities. This central area, the downtown parts of Toretsk, which includes this massive citadel and main road that connects to all these apartment complexes and hospitals and whatever it may be. And the Russian forces were able to push through those regions and do so in a way that's positioned them to push even deeper into the rear of Toretsk. And that's what we're seeing manifest right now. We're seeing them push past what would be, I believe, the Khimkolonka district, which would be this area over here. And now they're beginning to expand northwards into some of the private residential areas of the city in the northwestern location. So these areas should be easier actually to take over in a lot of cases, because you're looking at a lack of basements. You're looking at houses that are easier to destroy, so the Ukrainian soldiers can't really hide and they can't stay there all night. You're looking at regions that are more open for Russian soldiers to push through, and there's less of a Ukrainian staging point. There's less like landfills that they can utilize to project their firepower onto the Russian side. So really, what's helping out and doing the heavy lifting for the Ukrainian side over here would be the FPV crews, because those crews have been able to inflict very significant casualties onto the Russian side. I say that because I see the videos, and a lot of them are linked over here in the footage, and there is a really large amount coming out from the Voron unit of the 100th Mechanized Brigade. But that's to be expected when the main way that the Russians advance is not through armored vehicles protecting them and then pushing through the blocks, but it's through individual soldiers in very small groups, clearing out house by house. So here you can see Voron FPV strikes on houses in Toretsk on December 27th, indicating a crossing of the local division line over here into a new neighborhood in Toretsk. Here you can see on December 28th, the Predator Police Brigade killing a Russian soldier with a grenade drop here along one of the main roads of the city. Again, a Predator Police Brigade with FPV strikes or grenade drops onto individual Russian soldiers as they made their way deeper and deeper into Toretsk. So right now, the Russians are advancing across a very specific route across this highway region that then leads to Kostiantynivka, but that's a bit more long term. And they are about, let's see, 1 kilometer away from reaching the northern end of the city, which is just really massive, because there's a potential to create this bifurcation between the western and eastern parts of Toretsk still under Ukrainian control and then divide them up. But again, when it comes to the structure and the layout of what Ukrainians still control, it is actually very similar to the sort of houses, the sort of density of houses in the eastern suburbs of Toretsk that the Russians previously took over in the clashes during the summer. And then, of course, you have an area like Krimska that has still not been taken over in its entirety. But that's where we are currently with the fighting. And the Ukrainians have, of course, some of their notable units involved with the defense over here. Now, to look at the Kharkiv region, we do have a couple of updates. First of all, Lozova, Russian forces have taken over most, if not all of it, based on this geolocation from December 24th. You have the 27th Motor Rifle Brigade raising their flag in this location, meaning that everything east of this particular valley or this particular depression, there's like a ravine running through Lozova. All of the areas east of it have been taken over. The Ukrainian forces simply did not have the wherewithal to have several troops situated in such an exposed area, so disconnected from the main garrison. So the Ukrainians really have been falling back consistently over here to populated areas or to their pre-built trenches. You could see them manifest in 2 layers east of Borva, and then around Zakhrizhove, another area that is important because it is along the R79 highway. The Russian forces have been able to take over most of it. 77th Brigade, a Ukrainian element, they took 11 Russian POWs during an assault on December 23rd, and they conducted large FPV strikes targeting the Russian column that pushed from Kurakhove. So that initial advance was unsuccessful. But then here you have additional proof 3 days later of FPV or grenade drops onto individual Russian soldiers or vehicles. And once you see individual soldiers being targeted at the southern end of a village, that's pretty good indication that the Russian forces have been able to shift the mantle, shift over to the window in such a way that they control most of the settlements. And that means that they have access to the road to push southwards towards other Ukrainian holdings in this region, notably Nova, Kurakhove, and Bohuslavka. So keep an eye out for that. And it could sort of converge with the advance that is occurring around Lozova in order to take over all of the holdings, all of the Ukrainian territories that are north of this trench line. It's about an 8 kilometer area from north to south. Also, if we are to look a bit further to the north, we do have updates from the Dvorichnya area. You could see here this geolocation from December 21st. So it's really been a long time since I uploaded a video and give you guys an update. But of course, I have to mention it. That the Russians entered the Rakhovo neighborhood of Dvorichnya. Also, they entered the Palestina neighborhood. So they took over several private residential areas and duplexes over here. It's a rather small amount of territory, but you're looking at an area that the Ukrainians have been situated in for a very long time in a rather small Russian garrison that has actually been able to achieve a lot. They've been able to maintain a foothold across a river that is not trivial. It's not a trivial river like the Solona River is in many cases. This is actually the Oskil River, and it's not that wide over here, but it is still formidable because of the Ukrainian experience in this region, because of how disconnected it is from the line of contact. But regardless of that fact, now you have the Russians reaching the R79 or P79 road over here, almost at the center of the region now. Maybe things have changed since recent updates, and they now be maybe putting direct pressure onto the center, where you have the government offices, you have various warehouses, and just local facilities. It is a pretty important populated area, and getting control over it would also give the Russians access to two roads that branch out, one to the north and one to the south. The one to the south is very important because then it gives the Russians access to a northern flank of Kupiansk, and it's just so critical looking forward, not for now, but in the midterm, as the Russians tried to create shaping operations around Kupiansk, not the same way that they did a month ago or in the fall period, but there is still that Russian, of course, presence north of Kupiansk, that entire plan to take it over either from the east or now potentially also with this ancillary vector from the north. But we're going to have to see much more indication of that before I can say that definitively, because now we're looking in an area that is roughly, say, 12 kilometers, 13 kilometers away from that engagement in Kupiansk. Now, to finally look at the Kursk region, I want to zoom in on a couple of updates that I really should have mentioned, but I wasn't here to upload. Russians are in the center of Kirillovka. You can see here an FPV strike on December 21st, east of the Reka Suja River in this case. And so this is a relatively small hamlet, and that means the possibilities of further Russian advances are completely feasible. And it wouldn't be that difficult for the Russians to then have a permanent base across the Psel River, which is extremely threatening for the Ukrainians because it means that they would be able to put enormous terrain and pressure onto Suja from the south, which is, again, not expected. The Ukrainians really expected some of the blowback onto Suja to come directly from the east or directly from the north. But the pace of the Russian gains past Pokrovsk have been pretty significant and pretty large because of the lack of Ukrainian resistance in this particular area. And I mean, there is a lack of density when it comes to brigades defending over here, and also the fact that it is relatively open. There aren't that many large settlements on the road to Suja. But just remember, there aren't many paved roads either, so you're not seeing Russian armored advances. It's all being done on foot. So that's something to keep in mind going forward. But looking over to the north, where we're seeing the even more substantial Russian advances would be in the region east of Novoivanovka and south of Kruglenkoy. Further Russian gains over here. You can see nearly 8 square kilometers of territory being captured in open fields. This is just a consolidation of many areas that will be patches of Ukrainian resistance or areas of a gray zone, now just being fully consolidated over by the Russians. And then the Russians continue pressing forward along certain key vectors, like this particular road over here, the what is this, the Malaya-Loknaya road. And then you could see how it pushes eastwards, this Russian gain, and then branches out southwards. You could see the geolocations from October 18th, so that's not really relevant to this video. But over here, you can see December 23rd, Ukrainian paratroopers. The unit was not mentioned, but it could be 95th or 82nd, and they targeted Russian armored vehicles with ATGMs, mines, and drones on December 23rd as they made their initial forays into these locations that are extremely close to the Ukrainian garrison in the general Molayaloknaya region. It's only about 1.5 kilometers away at this choke point, and over here it's only 1 kilometer. So just extremely close within the range of direct fire. And then imagine all the mortars that are being moved close and the fiber optic FPVs that are really raining down on the Ukrainian troops trying to situate over here. So this is really, really important. The fact that the Russians have been able to solidify control over these large pockets that the Ukrainians have tried taking advantage of, not to hold on to the territory in its entirety, but to just create a sort of ambiguity where the Russians couldn't, fully solidify control over it and then use it for their own purposes. Because that's what the Ukrainians are trying to do. They're trying to drag out the fighting and deny the Russians attacks and new linchpins to utilize in the future. Past Kruglenkoy, the Russians have been able to advance. This was on December 21st, so a while ago. 17th Heavy Mechanized Brigade, they conducted FPV and artillery strikes towards Russian groups that are assaulting currently in Nikolaevka. But for now, the Ukrainians still hold in these locations. It's just that the Russians are very close to reaching the settlements themselves. And when you look at the measurements, they're about 5 kilometers away from cutting off the entirety of this northern salient, which would include areas like Pogrebki and a lot of the higher quality Ukrainian infantry are being told to dig in over here. And of course, that will lead to higher attrition rates, but it's being done in order to buy time for the Suja region, which really is exposed past these villages over here, this chain of villages, which runs all the way to Malaya Loknaya. You do have a few other settlements southwards, but they're more dispersed. They're less well built in terms of the preparation that the Ukrainians have for them. And there's just key roads that the Russians could use to steamroll past them and make it directly to Suja on not just one axis, but multiple axes. So that really is a top priority for the Ukrainians to drag out the fighting here in order to maintain a presence in Kursk as a negotiating chip. That's what they're thinking of right now. And so that's all that for today. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.